Today, we'll talk about romantic poetry. What are the chief characteristics of romantic poetry? Romantic poetry is the poetry of the Romantic era, an artistic, literary, musical, and intellectual movement that originated in Europe towards the end of the 18th century. It involved a reaction against prevailing Enlightenment ideas of the 18th century and lasted approximately from 1800 to 1850. In early 19th century England, the poet William Wordsworth defined his and Samuel Taylor Coleridge's innovative poetry in his preface to Lyrical Ballads 1798. I have said before that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin in emotions recollected in tranquility. The emotion is contemplated till, by a species of reaction, the tranquility gradually disappears and an emotion kindred to that which was before the subject of contemplation is gradually produced and does itself actually exist in the mind. The poems of lyrical ballads intentionally reimagined the way poetry should sound, that is, by fitting to metrical arrangement a selection of the real language of men. Wordsworth and his English contemporaries such as Coleridge, John Keats, Percy Shelley, and William Blake wrote poetry that was meant to boil up from serious, contemplative reflection over the interaction of humans with their environment. Indeed, Coleridge, in his essay on poesy or art, sees art as the media trees between and reconciler of nature and man. Such an attitude reflects what might be called the dominant theme of English Romantic poetry, the filtering of natural emotion through the human mind in order to create meaning. Now, the characteristics of English Romantic poetry. First characteristic is that it is sublime, the sublime. This is one of the most important concepts in Romantic poetry. The sublime in literature refers to use of language and description that excites thoughts and emotion beyond ordinary experience. Though often associated with grandeur, the sublime may also refer to the grotesque or other extraordinary experiences that take us beyond ourselves. The literary, the literary concept of the sublime became important in the 18th century. The idea of the sublime was taken up by Immanuel Kant and Romantic poets, including especially William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth, in his well known poem Tinton Abbey, he says, "Nor less I trust, to them I may have owed another gift, of aspect more sublime, that blessed mood in which the burden of the mystery." Next characteristic is reaction against neoclassicism. Romantic poetry contrasts with neoclassical poetry, which was the product of intellect and reason. While Romantic poetry is more the product of emotion, Romantic poetry at the beginning of the 19th century was a reaction against the set standards conventions of 18th century poetry. According to William J. Long, the Romantic movement was marked and is always marked by a strong reaction and protest against the bondage of rule and custom, which in science and theology, as well as literature, generally tend to fetter the free human spirit. Imagination. Belief in the importance of the imagination is a distinctive feature of romantic poets such as John Keats, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and Shelley. Unlike the neoclassical poets, Keats said, I am certain of nothing but of the holiness of the heart's affections and the truth of imagination. What the imagination seizes as duty must be truth. For Wordsworth and William Blake, as well as Victor Hugo and Manzoni, the imagination is a spiritual force, is related to morality, and they believed that literature, especially poetry, could improve the world. The secret of great art, Blake claimed, is the capacity to imagine. In his Ode to Nightingale, John Keats, he says, Thou wast not born for death, immortal bird. No hungry generations tread thee down. The voice I hear this passing night was heard in ancient days by emperor and clown. So you see how strong is the imagination of Keats. He immortalizes the bird and he grants immortality to the voice of nightingale. He says that the voice which he is hearing at present, it was heard in ancient days by even emperors and clowns. Now, even Shelley, in his Ode to the West Wind, he says, Thou on whose stream, mid the steep sky's commotion, loose clouds like earth's decaying leaves are shed, shook from the tangled boughs of heaven and ocean. Now, again, this imagination of Shelley is also very strong, and he talks about the activity of west wind on heaven, and he says that the west wind, it has the power to shake even the clouds in heaven. Nature poetry. The romantic poetry is chiefly related to nature. Love for nature is another important feature of romantic poetry as a source of inspiration. This poetry involves a relationship with external nature and places and a belief in pantheism. However, the Romantic poets differed in their views about nature. Wordsworth recognized nature as a living thing, teacher, God, and everything. Nature was his mentor. These feelings are fully developed and expressed in his epic poem, The Prelude. In his poem, The Tables Turn, he writes, One impulse from the vernal wood can teach you more of man, of moral evil and good, than all sages can. Shelley was another nature poet who believed that nature is a living thing and there's a union between nature and man. Wordsworth approaches nature philosophically while Shelley emphasizes the intellect. John Keats is another, a lover of nature, but Coleridge differs from other romantic poets of his age in that he has a realistic perspective on nature. He believes that nature is not the source of joy and pleasure, but rather that people's reaction to it depends on their mood and disposition. Coleridge believed that joy does not come from external nature, but that it emanates from the human heart. In Shelley, in uh, Ode to the West Wind, he says, O wild west wind, thou breath of autumn's being, thou from whose unseen presence the leaves dead are driven like ghosts from an enchanter fleeing. Keats expresses nature in this manner. In his Ode to Autumn, season of mist and mellow fruitfulness, Chloe's bosom friend of the maturing sun, conspiring with him how to load and bless with fruit the vines that round the thatched eaves run. Melancholy is another aspect of romantic poetry. Melancholy occupies a prominent place in romantic poetry and is an important source of inspiration for the romantic poets. In Ode to Nightingale, Keats wrote, "For many a time I have been half in love with easeful death, called him soft names in many a mused rhyme, to take into the air my quiet breath, now more than ever seems it rich to die, to seize upon the midnight with no pain." Ode to Nightingale is regarded as an autobiographical poem of Keats, and it is replenished with a melancholia, with a feeling of melancholy. Medievalism. Romantic poetry was attracted to nostalgia, and medievalism is another important characteristic of romantic poetry, especially in the works of John Keats and Coleridge. They were attracted to exotic, remote, and obscure places, and so they were more attracted to Middle Ages than to their own age. Keats's La Belle Dame Sans Mercy, The Eve of St. Agnes, and Coleridge's Christabel is full of medieval element. Now, I'll give you an example from Keats's La Bella Dame Sans Mercy. He says, "I met a lady in the meads, full beautiful, a fairy's child. Her hair was long, her foot was light, and her eyes were wide." This is an example from La Belle Dame Sans Mercy. That is a beautiful lady without pity. In the eve of St. Agnes, Keats says, "St. Agnes' Eve, ah, bitter chill it was. The owl, for all his feathers, was a cold. The hare limped trembling through the frozen grass, and silent was the flock in woolly field, woolly fold." Now, in Christabel, Coleridge expresses his medievalism in this manner. Again, Christabel is repellent with medievalism. He says, "She had dreams all yesternight of her own betrothed knight, and she in the midnight would will pray for the weal of a lover that's far away." Hellenism. Hellenism means Greek touch. There's a Greek touch in romantic poetry. The world of classical Greece was important to the Romantics. John Keats's poetry is full of allusions to the art, literature, and culture of Greece. As for example, in Ode to a Grecian Urn, he says, "Thou still unravished bride of quietness, thou foster child of silence and slow time, Sylvan historian, who canst thou express a flowery tale more sweetly than a rhyme?" So there's a Greek touch in this poem, in the Ode to Grecian Urn. Supernaturalism is another characteristic of romantic poetry. Most of the Romantic poets use supernatural elements in their poetry. Samuel Taylor Coleridge is the leading Romantic poet in this regard, and Kubla Khan is full of supernatural element. For example, he says in Kubla Khan, a, "A damsel with a dulcimer, in a vision once I saw. It was an Abyssinian maid, and on her dulcimer she played, singing of Mount Abora." Now, the last characteristic is subjectivity. Romantic poetry is the poetry of sentiments, emotions, and imagination. Romantic poetry opposed the objectivity of neoclassical poetry. Neoclassical poets avoided describing their personal elements in their poetry, unlike the Romantics. The poems of the Romantic poets are chiefly autobiographical in tone. Now, in the Ode to the West Wind, Shelley says, "If I were a dead leaf, thou mightest wear. If I were a swift cloud to fly with thee, a wave to bend beneath thy power and share." That means he wants to share the impulse of the west wind. He wants to be buoyant as he was in his youth. Now he is weighed down by the worries of the society. Similarly, in Ode to Nightingale, Keats also expresses the same feeling, the similar feeling. He says, "Fade far away, dissolve and quite forget, what thou among the leaves hast never known, the weariness, the fever, and the fret, here where men sit and hear each other grow." There's a touch of escapism. He says, "Fade far away, dissolve, and quite forget." He wants to uh, he wants to be oblivion from this world. He wants to fade away from this world. And he says that this world is full of misery, it's full of sorrow, and he is chiefly weighed down by the miseries of this world. So this poem again expresses the autobiographical elements, the subjective element of romantic poetry. Thank you.